The cowboy heard her crying through the blizzard before he ever saw her face. Snow slammed sideways through Black Ridge Pass as Levi fought to hold the horses steady. Then, between the wind and the creaking wagon wheels, he heard a woman whisper his name from somewhere below the cliff. His fingers tightened around the lantern handle while ice cracked beneath his boots. And when he finally found her in the ravine, one thing suddenly stopped making sense. Why was a frightened bride carrying railroad documents hidden inside her coat? Stay close till the end. This Western love story still has secrets buried beneath the snow. The wind carried dust through Red Canyon like smoke through a burned house. It rolled across the crooked storefronts, slipped beneath wagon wheels, and settled over the men gathered outside Mercer's saloon. Cowboys leaned against hitching posts, with coffee cups in their hands. Prospectors with empty pockets watched from the shade. Freight drivers smelled of sweat, leather, and desert miles. And near the center of town, beside a faded supply wagon from Santa Fe, 6 women stood waiting to be chosen. 5 already had. By late afternoon, only 1 remained. Clara Whitmore kept her hands folded in front of her dark traveling coat. The hem was dusty from weeks on the trail. Her gloves were worn thin near the fingertips. A cold Arizona wind tugged loose strands of brown hair from beneath her bonnet, but she never lifted a hand to fix them. The men kept staring anyway. She looked sick, too skinny for ranch life. She'd freeze dead before Christmas. One of the freight haulers spat tobacco into the dirt. Bet she's never touched a saddle in her whole life. A few laughed. Clara stood perfectly still through all of it. Only her hands betrayed her, tiny tremors beneath the gloves. Near the livestock pen, Levi Bennett tightened the strap beneath an old gray horse's jaw. The animal shifted tiredly beside him, ribs faintly visible beneath its winter coat. The horse was supposed to save his ranch, sell the horse, pay part of the land tax, buy another month. That had been the plan. Levi reached into his coat pocket and felt the $2 silver resting there, cold metal. Last money he had left. Behind him, somebody barked another laugh. Hell, maybe they should pay us to take her. Clara's eyes stayed fixed on the dirt road, not angry, not pleading, just tired in a way that settled deep into a person's bones. He recognized that look. He'd seen it in his own mirror plenty of mornings. Sheriff Doyle Hart stood beside the wagon, half bored, half embarrassed. Miss Whitmore came from Missouri, he announced awkwardly. Worked bookkeeping for a railroad office. Bookkeeping, somebody scoffed. Can bookkeeping survive a dust storm? More laughter. The sheriff rubbed his neck. Well, if nobody else is interested, arrangements can still be made for transport east, once. No. The word came from Levi before he realized he'd spoken. Heads turned. Levi walked forward slowly, boots crunching over red dirt. His coat carried the smell of horses and cedar smoke. Sunlight caught the rough stubble along his jaw. Sheriff Hart frowned. Levi ignored him. Clara finally looked up. For a second, neither of them spoke. Her eyes were gray, sharp, careful, not weak, just exhausted. Levi pulled the $2 silver from his pocket and dropped them onto the sheriff's crate. The coins clinked loud enough to stop every voice around them. Then he unstrapped the worn saddle from his horse and set it beside the money. This too. A silence settled over the street. One man let out a disbelieving laugh. You trading your last saddle for a bride? Looks that way, Levi said. Sheriff Hart stared at him. Levi, you sure about this? You still owe county taxes. I know what I owe. The sheriff lowered his voice. You can't afford this. Levi glanced once toward Clara. Maybe I can't afford not to. Nobody laughed after that. The wind crept through town again. Somewhere farther down the street, piano music drifted faintly from the saloon. Sheriff Hart finally pulled out the folded papers. Clara took the pen carefully when it was offered to her. Levi noticed ink stains faintly marking the side of her fingers beneath the gloves. Old habits from another life. Her signature was neat, precise. Clara Whitmore. Then she stepped back from the crate. "You understand," she said quietly. "I don't know how to be a ranch wife." Levi folded the papers once and slid them into his coat pocket. "I don't know how to be a husband," he answered. That almost pulled a smile from her, almost. The crowd slowly drifted apart after that, disappointed the spectacle was over. Someone muttered that Levi Bennett had finally gone crazy. Another man offered him $20 for the old horse before winter killed it anyway. Levi never answered. Clara picked up her small suitcase herself. It looked too light to carry a whole life inside it. As the sun began dropping behind the Red Canyon cliffs, Levi helped her into the wagon beside him. The wooden seat creaked beneath their weight. For a while they rode in silence through the desert road north of town. Dust followed the wheels. Far ahead, the red rock cliffs burned orange beneath the evening sky. Finally, Clara spoke without looking at him. "Why would a man spend his last money on someone nobody wants?" Levi kept his eyes on the trail. A long moment passed. The leather reins creaked softly in his hands, but he never answered. And somewhere beneath Clara Whitmore's quiet voice and careful posture, Levi Bennett began to understand one thing. Whatever she had run from in Missouri, it was still following her. Levi could feel it riding beside them all the way north of Red Canyon. The wagon wheels rattled over dry stone as evening settled across the Arizona desert. Red cliffs stretched toward the darkening sky like giant walls burned by the sun. Far off, a coyote cried once, then disappeared into the wind. Clara sat straight beside him the entire ride. Too straight, like someone afraid to fall asleep around strangers. Levi noticed little things, the way she watched every passing rider, the way her hand tightened around the handle of her suitcase whenever they passed another wagon on the trail. Twice she looked behind them. By the time they reached the ranch, night had settled over the canyon. Levi's cabin stood above a narrow ridge of red stone, tucked beside a crooked cottonwood tree that looked half dead from drought. The barn leaned badly to one side, fence posts sagged. One lantern burned weakly near the horse pen. Clara stared quietly at the place. Levi climbed down first. "It looks worse at night." That was supposed to help, not particularly. A faint breath escaped her nose. Almost a laugh, almost. The old ranch gate groaned as Levi pushed it open. One of the hinges hung loose. He made a mental note to fix it, same as he had every week for nearly 6 months. Inside the barn, 3 horses lifted their heads from the trough. Clara stopped near the stall door. "You train freight horses? Used to train more. How many do you have left?" Levi rubbed the back of his neck. "Enough to keep creditors interested." She looked at him then, really looked. His coat sleeves were patched near the elbows. His boots had been resoled by hand. Even the barn smelled thin. Not enough hay, not enough grain. The kind of poverty that settled slowly. The cabin was warm at least. Levi lit another lamp while Clara stood near the doorway taking in the room. Small iron stove. One table. One shelf of worn books. A cracked coffee mug drying beside the sink basin. And only one bedroom. Levi noticed when her eyes found the open doorway. "You take the room," he said. She frowned immediately. "Mr. Bennett." "Levi, you can't sleep out here while I take your bed. I've slept in worse places. That doesn't make it right." Levi shrugged out of his coat and hung it near the stove. "Mom, after today, I don't believe either of us got the life we expected." Silence settled between them. Then Clara quietly set her suitcase beside the bedroom door. Later, while Levi worked outside checking the horse troughs by lantern light, Clara sat alone at the kitchen table. She noticed the stack of papers first. Receipts, transport invoices, tax notices. One envelope stamped "Final Warning." She hesitated before touching any of it, then slowly pulled the papers closer. By the time Levi came inside, she had arranged everything into careful piles across the table. He stopped in the doorway. "You read all that? You were charged twice for feed deliveries in August." Levi blinked. Clara pointed at 2 receipts beside the lantern, same shipment. Different handwriting. He stepped closer. Sure enough, his jaw tightened. Damn, there's more. She slid another paper toward him. Your freight contract through Black Mesa Pass. The percentages changed here. Her finger tapped a line of numbers. Someone reduced your payment after signing. Levi stared at the page. That route used to keep this ranch alive, he said quietly. Who controls freight contracts around Red Canyon? He gave a humorless smile. Vernon Pike. Even Clara seemed to recognize the name. The transport man in town? He owns freight routes from here to Tucson, wagons, supply depots. Half the stores in Red Canyon. Levi pulled out a chair slowly. And he wants my land. Why? The Canyon Pass runs through my property. Shortest winter route north. Clara looked down at the altered contract again. He's been bleeding you dry. Levi didn't answer, because she was right. A sudden smell filled the room. Burning. Clara turned sharply toward the stove. The bread. She rushed over too late. Smoke curled from the blackened loaf pan, while Levi quickly opened the stove door. I'm sorry, she said immediately, embarrassed. I was reading and forgot. It's fine. It's charcoal. Levi cut off a piece anyway. Crunch, he chewed slowly. Clara stared at him in disbelief. You don't have to pretend it tastes acceptable. It doesn't. Then why are you eating it? Levi swallowed and reached for the coffee pot. Because you tried. Something softened briefly in her face after that, not trust yet. But something close enough to notice. The wind picked up harder outside near midnight. Levi had just stretched out beside the stove when the horses suddenly began kicking inside the barn. Hard, violent. He sat up instantly. Another sound followed, the sharp slam of the corral gate. Levi grabbed the rifle beside the door and rushed outside into the freezing desert wind. Lantern light swung wildly across the yard. The gate stood open. 3 horses were gone, and far down the canyon trail, hoofbeats disappeared into the dark. Levi stood motionless for one long second beneath the swinging lantern. Then he ran. Cold desert wind hit hard against his face as he crossed the yard. Gravel slid beneath his boots. The rifle stayed tight in his hand while darkness swallowed the canyon road ahead. Behind him, the cabin door opened. Levi. Clara's voice carried through the night. He didn't stop. The tracks were easy enough to see by lantern light. 3 horses forced hard down the narrow trail leading east toward Black Ridge Pass. Not thieves looking to sell. Too clean. Too deliberate. Levi crouched near the dust and touched the fresh marks beside the hoofprints. Boot heels. 2 riders. He already knew who. When he finally returned near dawn, Clara sat wrapped in a wool blanket beside the stove. The coffee pot had gone cold hours ago, but she'd kept the fire alive. She looked up immediately when he stepped inside. You found them? Levi shut the door harder than he meant to. No. The words sat heavy between them. He removed his gloves slowly. His knuckles were scraped raw from grabbing frozen rock in the dark. Clara stood without speaking and poured fresh coffee into a chipped tin cup. She handed it to him carefully. Levi noticed her hands weren't shaking anymore. You know who did it, she said quietly. Yeah, Mr. Pike. Levi drank once before answering. Vernon Pike doesn't steal horses because he needs horses. He stared into the black coffee. He steals them so a man starts counting what he's got left. Outside, morning light crept slowly across the canyon walls. Thin and pale, winter was getting closer. Later that afternoon, an old buckboard wagon climbed the trail toward the ranch. The horse pulling it limped slightly. Amos Reed sat hunched beneath a coat lined with sheep wool. One bad leg stretched stiff beside him. You look terrible, Amos called before even climbing down. Levi leaned against the corral fence. Good to see you, too. Amos spotted Clara standing near the porch and removed his hat politely. So that's the woman folks been talking about. Clara nodded once. I imagine they've had plenty to say. Town's mostly bored people with weak coffee and too much free time. Amos grinned. Don't pay it mind. He handed Levi a folded paper. Levi opened it and felt his stomach tighten. A tax notice. Past due again. If that ain't enough, Amos muttered. Pike bought out the feed supplier this morning. Prices doubled. Levi laughed once under his breath, no humor in it. Of course they did. Clara quietly held out her hand for the paper. Levi hesitated, then passed it over. She read every line carefully. He's trying to force foreclosure before winter. Amos blinked at her. Well now, you catch on quick? Clara folded the notice neatly again. How long before they seize the ranch? Levi looked toward the distant cliffs. 2 months maybe. Less if the horses stop bringing work. Silence settled over the yard. A hawk circled overhead. Then Clara asked the question that changed everything. Do you still own the Black Ridge route? Levi frowned slightly. Technically. And nobody else can legally transport through the northern pass without your signature? That's the law. Clara's eyes sharpened for the first time since arriving. Then Pike doesn't want your horses. She looked down at the papers again. He wants you desperate enough to sell the route. Amos stared at her. Levi slowly pushed off the fence. That route's dead half the winter. Not all winter. The men looked at her. Clara crossed into the cabin and disappeared into the bedroom. A moment later, she returned carrying an old leather satchel. From inside it, she pulled several folded railroad circulars and freight bulletins she'd carried all the way from Missouri. Levi watched her spread them across the table. One advertisement had fresh ink circles around it. United States Army Supply Office, Fort Stanton, New Mexico Territory. Immediate need, cold weather freight horses. High payment guaranteed. Levi read it twice. That posting's 3 weeks old, which means they still haven't found enough stock. Clara pointed toward the listed route dates. If we move fast enough, we can still reach them before heavy snow closes Black Ridge. Amos looked between them slowly. That's a winter run. I know, Levi said. No freight teams crossed Black Ridge this late in the year since '71. I know. The old man's eyes drifted toward Clara. You really think this can save the ranch? Clara looked directly at Levi before answering. I think it's the only thing standing between him and Vernon Pike. The room went quiet again. Levi stared down at the military notice while wind rattled softly against the cabin walls. A dangerous idea. The kind men followed when they had nothing left to lose. Finally, Amos sighed. Well, he reached for the coffee pot. If you're both crazy enough to try it, you'll need another rider. Levi frowned. Your leg can barely survive town roads. Wasn't talking about me. Amos poured himself coffee. There's a young cowboy works part-time near Pike's freight yard. Name's Noah Briggs. Levi recognized it immediately. Noah's loyal to Pike. Not anymore. Amos drank slowly. Pike beat the hell out of Noah's younger brother last month over missing inventory. Clara's face tightened slightly. Would he help us? Amos stared out the cabin window toward the dark northern mountains. If he believes Pike's finally gone too far, he took another slow sip. Maybe. Snow arrived 2 nights later. Not much at first, just thin white streaks drifting across the canyon after sunset. But men who lived long enough in Arizona territory knew how winter worked in the high country. The mountains warned you before they buried you. By dawn, Levi already had the horses saddled near the lower corral. Their breath rolled thick into the freezing air while leather harnesses creaked softly in the pale light. Clara stepped out onto the porch wearing one of Levi's old wool coats over her blue dress. The sleeves hung too long past her wrists. Levi noticed. He looked away before she caught him staring. You should stay in town until we return, he said, while tightening a saddle strap. Clara walked down into the yard. You know I'm not doing that. This isn't a supply run. Levi glanced toward the northern cliffs. Black Ridge kills people this time of year, and losing the ranch won't. That ended the argument. A wagon rattled up near sunrise. Noah Briggs climbed down slowly, hat pulled low against the wind. He looked younger than Clara expected, maybe 24. Tired eyes, bruises still yellowing along one side of his jaw. Levi watched him carefully. You sure about this? Noah shrugged once. Sure enough, he handed Levi a folded Winchester rifle. Figured you might need an extra. Clara caught the hesitation in Noah's face when he looked toward the canyon trail. Not fear of the mountain, fear of Vernon Pike. By mid-morning, they started north. 7 freight horses remained after the theft, strong enough for the army contract if the weather held. The narrow trail climbed steadily through red stone ridges dusted with snow. Wind hissed through dry cedar trees while wagon wheels cracked over frozen ground. Nobody talked much. That was Western travel in winter. Save your breath. Listen to the weather. Near sunset, they reached an abandoned line shack beside a shallow creek. Half the roof sagged inward, but the stovepipe still stood. Levi unsaddled the horses while Noah gathered wood. Clara knelt beside the small iron stove, striking matches against her boot heel until flames finally caught. Orange light filled the shack slowly. For the first time all day, the cold eased from their hands. Noah ate beans straight from a tin cup before finally speaking. Pike knows you're heading north. Levi didn't look up from sharpening his knife. I figured. He's got men watching the southern crossings. Noah swallowed hard. If weather traps you up there, he'll wait till spring and take the ranch clean. Clara quietly unfolded the army contract again beside the firelight. There won't be a spring for this ranch unless we reach Fort Stanton. Wind rattled the cabin walls. Then Noah looked toward her carefully. You really trust him? Clara glanced across the fire toward Levi. Levi sat near the doorway repairing a torn rein with steady hands. Quiet man, tired eyes. Coat sleeves burned from years near campfires. A man who spent his last 2 silver dollars on someone the whole town laughed at. I do, she answered softly. Levi's hands paused for half a second. Nothing else. But Clara noticed. The storm reached them before dawn. Hard wind slammed against the shack so violently the horses screamed outside. Snow blasted sideways through cracks in the wood walls. Levi threw the door open and rushed into the storm without hesitation. By the time Clara followed him outside, visibility had nearly vanished. White everywhere. The horses pulled wildly against their ropes. Noah fought to calm 2 frightened mares, while Levi secured the wagon wheels with stone blocks before the wind pushed them downhill. Then one sharp sound cut through the storm, a crack, wood splitting. Levi spun instantly. The narrow bridge ahead across Black Ridge Creek had started breaking apart beneath ice and rushing water. We move now, Levi shouted. There was no choice anymore. They crossed single file into the white storm. Snow stung Clara's face so hard it felt like sand. The world disappeared 10 feet ahead. Only the sound of horses remained. Leather straps, hooves crushing ice, men shouting through the wind. Then suddenly, nothing. Clara stopped. The line ahead was gone. No horses, no wagon. Only white fog spinning around her. Panic rose sharp in her chest. Levi! The wind swallowed her voice immediately. She turned once. Twice, wrong direction. Her boot slipped against hidden ice beneath the snow. The ground vanished under her. Clara crashed hard down a narrow, rocky slope before slamming against frozen stone inside a shallow ravine. Pain shot through her shoulder. Above her, the storm roared endlessly. For one terrible moment, she realized nobody could see where she'd fallen, and the cold was already creeping into her hands. Far above, faint through the storm, someone shouted her name. Clara! Levi's voice barely carried through the wind, but she heard it. She tried to answer. Cold air burned her throat. I'm here! Snow kept sliding down the narrow ravine walls around her. Loose ice rattled against stone beside her boots. Then she saw him. A dark figure pushing through the white storm, with one hand shielding his face. Levi half slid down the rocky slope toward her, boots digging hard into the snow. When he finally reached her, he grabbed both her shoulders fast. You hurt? She shook her head too quickly. My shoulder, that's all. Levi exhaled once. Sharp, quiet, like a man who'd been holding his breath too long. Snow clung to his beard and coat collar. One side of his glove had split open from the climb, leaving blood across his knuckles where rock had torn the skin. Clara stared at the blood. "You came back alone." "Course I did." The answer came so naturally it almost hurt. Above them, the storm screamed through Black Ridge Pass. Levi looked upward toward the hidden trail. "We need to move." He helped her stand carefully. When she winced, his hand tightened around her arm without thinking. Not possessive, protective. The climb out took nearly 20 minutes. Snow kept collapsing beneath their boots, while freezing wind pushed sideways through the canyon walls. By the time they reached the trail again, Noah had gathered the horses beneath a cluster of pine trees beside the broken bridge. The wagon leaned dangerously near the creek edge. "You found her," Noah breathed. Levi ignored him. He guided Clara toward the fire Noah had managed to build beneath an overhang of rock. "Sit, I'm all right." "Sit anyway." She sat. Levi crouched beside the fire and pulled off his gloves slowly. His hands shook slightly now that the danger had passed. That frightened Clara more than the storm, because until now she had never seen him afraid. Noah handed Levi a blackened coffee pot from the fire. "Tastes terrible," he muttered. Levi took a drink anyway and passed it to Clara. The coffee was bitter and smoky and too hot against her frozen lips. Still, she held the cup longer than necessary because the warmth felt human. Night closed around them early. The storm made further travel impossible, so they sheltered inside an abandoned freight shed, half buried against the mountain rocks. Broken wagon wheels leaned against one wall. Rusted horseshoes hung from old nails beside collapsed crates stamped with army markings from years earlier. Levi spread extra blankets near the stove for Clara. "You should sleep." "You won't? Someone's got to keep the fire alive." She watched him feed another piece of cedar into the stove. Orange light moved across his face. Across the scar near his jaw she had noticed before but never asked about. Outside, wind hammered against the building like fists. "Back in Missouri," Clara said quietly. Storm sounded different. Levi glanced up. "More rain there? More trains?" For a moment neither spoke. Then Clara stared into the fire. "I didn't steal from the railroad company." Levi stayed still. The owner's son gambled away payroll money. Her fingers tightened around the coffee cup. When the books stopped balancing, they needed someone to blame. Snow hissed against the roof. "I could fought it," she whispered. "But my younger brother worked for them too. They threatened to jail him beside me." Levi's jaw tightened slowly. "So you took it." She nodded once. The silence afterward stretched long and heavy. Not judgment, something worse, understanding. Finally, Levi looked at her fully. "You've been carrying that alone this whole time." Clara tried answering, but emotion caught hard in her throat instead. She turned her face away toward the dark wall before he could see tears gathering in her eyes. But he already had. Levi stood quietly and removed his heavy wool coat. Then he placed it around her shoulders without another word. The gesture nearly broke her. Outside, somewhere deep in the storm, horses suddenly began screaming. All three of them froze. Then Noah rushed toward the window. "There's riders out there." Levi was already reaching for his rifle. And maybe that's the part folks remember most about stories like this. The storm. The gunfire waiting in the dark. The mountains trying to bury good people alive. But truth is, the thing that stayed with Clara wasn't the fear. It was the moment someone finally came back for her. Not because he had to. Not because a paper she belonged to him. But because somewhere along that frozen trail, a lonely cowboy decided her life mattered as much as his own. If you've ever sat awake at night wondering whether the world still had a place for you, you probably understand that feeling better than most. Sometimes healing doesn't arrive loudly. Sometimes it's just a tired man handing you the warm side of a coffee cup. A lantern left burning in the window. A horse waiting, saddled before sunrise, because someone refuses to leave you behind. Out on the Arizona frontier, $2 silver didn't buy love. but kindness opened the door for it. And maybe that's what keeps people going through hard winters. The hope that one small act of mercy can still change the direction of a life. If this story stayed with you tonight, tell us where you're listening from, or which moment touched your heart the most. And if you'd like, stay a little longer. There are still more dusty trails, forgotten souls, and quiet Western love stories waiting just beyond the next firelight.